So, Wolfgang, it's great to see you. And it occurs to me that it's extremely poetic that we should be sitting here in Fabrica in Brighton on the day after your show finishes, and that we're in the process of deconstructing your Kiosk work. And you know, the whole business of architecture being made and unmade and then made and remade is a proposition which is crucial to a lot of your work. But I thought we would start by talking about a static piece, which is the shelters sculpture that you made in 2000, which is an arrangement of 3 bus shelters, or sculptures that look like bus shelters. So I wondered if you could tell us what it was, what was occurring to you, what was it that led you to that sort of aesthetic conclusion?
Yes, shelters is actually one of the key works I made early in the 2000s. And it was the first time that I actually used architecture. I was interested in using architecture in my work, which has become obviously very important in my practice since then. So I was at that time very much interested in Japanese garden design, tea ceremony, Zen meditation, all that kind of things. And there was, I discovered that within the tea ceremony or in Japanese gardens, you find these shelters which look like bus shelters. They are little waiting rooms. And they are basically there to wait and get ready for the tea ceremony. And in Zen meditation, waiting is perceived as gaining time rather than losing it. So it's quite the opposite of how we perceive a shelter in the urban context. So, and I was really intrigued by that idea to play with that. So I wanted to make a copy of a bus shelter we all associate with, as I say, waiting for the bus, wasting of time, and then turn it into a pavilion where you all of a sudden had the desire to spend time in rather than to avoid it.
But in this case, there's no access, is it? I mean, you've got these 3 shelters positioned in such a way that you can see inside, but you can't actually be inside.
Exactly. So by creating a shelter that is not accessible, I kind of wanted to encourage even more the desire to get in, because people really always try to get in. And you envisage yourself being in there, but you can't access it. So you go around, but in your imagination you access it. And that was one key thing why I needed 3 in order to create this inaccessible pavilion, which is very transparent, and you could sit in there, but you can't.
And this idea of taking something out of its original context, because of course they do look like bus shelters. I mean, we don't think of them as a shelter in a Japanese garden, you know, where you wait for your tea ceremony, etc. So we read them very much as something that we see sort of in everyday life, and you know, part of the built environment, something that's very functional, but you're making it unfunctional, and you're putting it into a different context, and so you're making us see it differently.
Absolutely. So I wanted to create a space where people kind of reflect or see the objects we have, like the street furniture of a bus shelter, in a different light, and create a space that questions our understanding of urban furniture, public space in that sense, or how we use objects. As I said, I was inspired by the idea of time or waiting as a means to gain time rather than to lose it. I really liked that idea a lot. And then I wanted to turn, as I say, this street furniture into this kind of space that we so desire to enter and spend time in.
And it's almost a kind of meditation on time and the passage of time, but in subsequent work, and in particular House Birmingham, the work that we were involved in making together in 2004 in Birmingham, time is absolutely crucial to that work. Not only the work, but also how you document it as well. I mean, there you've got, rather, in shelters, what you have are works that have been moved. And you know that, they've been moved because they've been translated from what is their very familiar context to the dedicated art space. But in House Birmingham and a number of projects that you've made like that, I mean, it wasn't the first and it wasn't the last, the object actually moves.
Exactly. I mean, this is why I think it links quite nicely with the house projects or House Birmingham, the shelters, because on one hand, what I created was this overlapping piece of architecture that create a new kind of space. Now, with House Birmingham, I wanted to do a very similar thing, kind of overlap architecture or put two rows of terraced houses in that context on top of each other, but in a way so they are animated. So they're not physically there at the same time, but they are kind of like dancing around each other. And as you know, we've chosen Centenary Square as this kind of vast open space in Birmingham that at that time at least didn't have a lot of personality, and the whole history of it was erased. And then you told me that originally there were rows of terraced houses, Victorian houses, and they have been demolished in order to create this new Americanized town center of Birmingham. And I thought I'd bring that history back a bit by recreating these terraced houses, but in a way that they become animated, that they have a time aspect, they appear and disappear. So these two terraced houses were constructed in a way that each wall of each terrace went up and went down simultaneously, and then the next bit got constructed, and they kind of moved along like a Mexican wave in a football stadium, you could say. So the walls appeared and disappeared simultaneously, and what you got by the two terraces is like two walls dancing around each other. Yes, and this is how I wanted to kind of animate the place.
And you're referring to architecture that was there, kind of architecture was there, and wasn't anymore. And you're building with such material, a kind of recyclable brick, which is really important actually in terms of medium being the message, because you use it, you reuse it and reuse it and reuse it in order to create something that one would normally think of as being there for decades, if not centuries. But it's a bit of a building that's just there for a day, with all the fascination that we have with construction sites. People love seeing these things sort of go up. In fact, it was very funny. I remember people passing by thinking that for some strange reason there was a housing estate being built on Centenary Square, with this incongruous backdrop of these high-rise buildings in this very civic environment. The permanence of architecture, and particularly in a civic context, to suggest stability and kind of good old fashioned values, truth and beauty, then becomes a place where you're building and unbuilding, you're dancing with architecture, and that you don't see that very often.
Yes, in a way, what I did, I kind of questioned, as you said, the permanence of architecture, by animating it, and in a way taking away the foundation of the idea of the permanence of architecture. And what was also quite interesting was that obviously the main audience were the volunteers who worked on the project, all the building students from the various colleges involved in the project, who got trained on this new dry joint building technology, which, as you know, clicks like Lego blocks into each other, so we could take it apart without creating a lot of waste, so building and unbuilding very easily. And for them, it was so difficult as bricklayers to build something up and half an hour later to take it down again. Because in a way, it completely questions their identity as well. And I thought that was quite interesting. And at the beginning, they really struggled with it. But over the course of the project, they became advocates of the project. They took on ownership and they communicated it wonderful to the audience.
And the idea of the building being there and not being there, in the same way that you're talking about time not being wasted but time created, you know, something that's invisible or transparent in the shelters. I mean, there's a sort of poignancy in the absence of the buildings that you're referring to as well. I mean, the way time has passed, you know, and historic circumstances change. I mean, something may have been in that place which isn't there decades later when we are, and you're making us aware of that. And it's maybe melancholic is too strong a word, but there's a poignancy in that.
Yes, and also that it was very important for me that people really see the changes on a daily basis, because lots of commuters pass the place in the morning and come back in the evening, and it was important for me that they realize the change by then. So the whole building site has completely transformed in this few hours from during the day. And obviously people would see only parts of the building, but never the completed building or the two completed overlap buildings. And this is also where photography comes in, my interest in photography. So I thought a little bit, how can I capture that using photography?
Yes, well, I don't see, I mean, the photography is much more than documentation from my point of view. It almost becomes another work or integral to the project as a whole. And the film that was produced through stop frame photography is extraordinary. I mean, there's extraordinary passage of time that we witness, days coming and going as houses come and go, and we're sort of moving around. I mean, literally, we're tracing a circle around the project that finishes, I think, at the end of the film. You go around once, as I recall. Do you want to talk about the documentation of the work in that case? I mean, because it does feel like it's so much more, you know, than just sort of a record, you know, for us to then subsequently see something that's disappeared.
Yes. Yes, as you rightly observed, there have been three aspects to House Birmingham. One was obviously the building activity itself, the building and unbuilding of the terraces. And the second one was the photography, which started off as a new form of documentation. But as you said, it's not really documentation, it's an own piece of artwork. And it's what I've done, basically, I put up 3 or 4 large format analog cameras, black and white cameras, where I exposed the film over the whole duration of the project. By doing that, I captured all the activities that happened during House Birmingham onto one photographic plate. So the photographs became the means of showing or experiencing the whole building activity in one artwork. So in that sense, the documentation was the only way that revealed the overall buildings rather than the process itself. So that was one of my reasons why I did it. And because it's done as a long exposure photograph, it had this kind of ghostly feel to it, which I thought was also quite interesting and added a different dimension to the reading of the project. And the third aspect was the film. I thought it was a good opportunity to do a proper time-lapse movie, but not a static one, as you would expect, but to have a time-lapse movie where the camera would travel around in a circle around the whole project over the duration of the 12 days. and basically start filming the empty space and then start moving and recording all the building activities and then finishing exactly at the same spot after 12 days where everything was gone. And by that, creating this kind of the potential for an endless loop of film. What I think was quite nice, first of all, it worked from a technical point of view because obviously it's quite challenging. So I was very happy with that. And also what was quite nice that we did exactly 12 days, which in a way referred back to a clock with us 12 hours. So, and you had this kind of wonderful kind of, new reading of the time aspect of the building and unbuilding in the film.
Wonderful in the film to see, the sun rises, the light fills that space, and then at the end of the day it disappears, and all the street lights come on, and lights in buildings around, and then the extraordinary weather, and it reminds you that that all of this human activity goes on underneath or in the midst of all this natural phenomena.
Yeah, absolutely. So the time aspect is not just the building and unbuilding, as you said, it's also the overall activity on the space itself, the visitors coming, going, interacting with the builders, the weather, the wind, the light changes. So that is all captured in the film and in the photographs.
Actually, going back to the photographs, that's what you say is interesting, their kind of ghostly presence, because in those photographs it's like you're looking through the buildings in a way that you're looking through the shelters in that earlier work. I mean, the fact that they are transparent again suggests a sort of insubstantiality or a kind of their fugitive nature. Absolutely.
And what I find also quite interesting is that obviously the longer the bricks were on its place, the more that got exposed onto the film. That means they show up more, which means you have the foundation of the buildings longer there, and so they're showing up more white because the bricks were white. And the further you go up, the further they kind of disappear into the sky and kind of blend into the other architecture behind. So I found that also quite amazing, because obviously you can't predict the result. It's an experiment when you do these long exposure photographs, and you never know what comes out at the end. But I was very pleased when I saw the House Birmingham photographs.
Lucky that everything went according to plan, that it did take 12 days after all.
Exactly.
And now this is a project, one of a number that have taken place with the building and unbuilding of architectural structures. They've happened in Paris, I know, Birmingham, but the project we're going to talk about now is Le Terme in Milan. Happened 4 years later, and obviously, you're sort of developing a practice. In this case, it doesn't involve there's an unbuilding and building, but you're not dancing around with buildings in the same way. And you're referring to a piece of architecture which is subterranean rather than a piece of architecture that would have been in that space. If there was a ghost haunting it, you'd be intersecting it. But here, you're reflecting it.
Yes. After House Birmingham, I got a lot of interest from other galleries and museums to do more of these type of projects. And I was very lucky to get also invited by a gallery in Milan to do a project there. And when we walked around the city and looked at various potential places to do the project, we came across Piazza Oberdan, and there were, oddly enough, two very large columns, classical columns, standing right in the middle of the piazza. And that was immediately very intriguing for me. And I asked the gallerist, so what is that? I mean, can I work with those columns? And then she mentioned, there is an underneath bathhouse from the Mussolini era, from the 1930s. And these columns are basically the chimneys of the heating system, hidden in some sort of Roman architecture. And I got immediately very much intrigued. And I thought, oh, we need to do a project about this hidden architecture underneath the piazza itself. So, so I suggested to her to do a different project, not to do any more house projects, but to kind of directly link the work to the existing architecture, which is hidden underneath. And it took us a few months to get access to that, because obviously nobody in the city of Milan was interested, nobody had the keys anymore. And after really pestering the administrators, finally they said, well, just get a big bolt cutter and cut the lock open and just go in and have a look. So we did. We got a big bolt cutter, went into the space, in the subterranean space, and walked around with our torches. And there was this amazing world underneath. I felt like Indiana Jones, I have to say. All these cobwebs, and then there were these marble bathtubs, all the furniture, you know, mahogany shops for fingernail manicure and hair cutting, and I mean completely abundant and locked up, frozen in time. So it was a piece of architecture that you kind of discovered down there that had been completely forgotten. And the most interesting bit then was I found the office. There was a little office, and there was still the desk in there, completely full of dust with an old chair. And I opened the drawers, and in one of the drawers, I discovered the original architectural plans of the whole space. Can you imagine? Fold them out from the 1930s, architectural drawings. Of course, I took them, I scanned them, and gave them back to the city of Milan, saying they should be in your archive, not rotting away down there. But I had the original plans, and then I could kind of develop a contemporary response to those plans. So what I did, I took elements of the architecture and transferred them upwards on top of the piazza by mirroring it, so they are kind of reflected exactly where the surface was. So the columns were upside down, and you know, lots of various architectural features we copied and turned upside down. So in a way, this time the architecture was floating on the scaffolding, because obviously they needed to be reflected, and there was this distance of the earth underneath. So we had this kind of floating architecture on the scaffolding platforms.
And it was built and unbuilt and then built again. I mean, was it a constant movement of material?
Exactly. It was in that case a really constant movement. So we started in one end, and it's a 60-meter long piece of architecture. So we started with a 5-meter section. We built it up, and once we dismantled the beginning, we added it at the front. So the wall was literally moving. It was not just humping, it was like you took one brick from the beginning and put it basically at the front. So it was rolling along, so to say. And it took us 12 days again to complete the whole circle of this kind of architecture. So 60 meters in one direction, then about 10 meters, and then 60 meters back. And the funny thing was that the space itself was still used as a marketplace on weekends. So we were kind of like building in between these market stalls, and that was great. So, and we really got on with the market people quite nicely, and they found it really funny. So we really ran even into the market stalls at the end, into a little bookshop that sold books. So we literally stopped kind of a couple of centimeters before his books. And that was the end of the project. So we couldn't complete the whole building because one corner was permanently occupied by these kind of market stalls. Yes, and the people really got a big discussion going, a local discussion, because lots of elderly people remembered the place, obviously from their childhoods, but most of the young people had completely forgotten about it. So in a way, we triggered also a political debate locally, what should happen to this space down there.
And subsequently, do you know if anything has happened?
Yes, because next to Piazza Oberdan, there is a contemporary art gallery cultural center called Spazio Oberdan. and they kind of like took it on, at least for some follow-up projects. And I remember that Sarah Luca had a show down there using these kind of empty spaces in combination with her sculptures.
I mean, they are extraordinary, extraordinarily evocative. And of course, there's an architectural style, you know, that kind of fascist classicism that, you know, was so predominant at the time. But there's a simplicity about it too. We talked about functionalism before, but there's a nice minimalism that appeals to you too, I think. Absolutely.
Obviously, I can't, through the process I'm using, I can't copy one-to-one all architectural details, but I can, in an abstract way, kind of reinterpret it in a more contemporary art way, using this kind of breeze blocks technique of building and unbuilding. Again, I used photography to record the whole project, like I did with House Birmingham. And the interesting bit with the recording here was that the weather was not always perfect. So you sometimes see a bit of architecture when the sun was out, and sometimes you don't. So it's far more, how do you say, elusive, the whole final photograph. And in one photograph particularly, it was quite nice to see the stall of the booksellers open and closed at the same time. So it becomes another piece of transparent architecture.
The fact that you're locating these works in public spaces is significant, I think. I mean, they're not, unlike the Shelters piece, they're not in a space that's dedicated to art. It's not a gallery or a museum. So you're engaging passers-by, people who aren't expecting to trip over contemporary art, you know, and then what could be more fascinating than something going on, like, you know, the kind of activity that you find in a construction site. Now, these are public spaces, and, you know, reminding us of, you know, how the built environment is something that's considered very important by those who have certain kind of political power, you know, and, you know, for that reason, urban planning is, you know, such a sort of loaded area. Then you're starting another project soon after this, Le Terme, which doesn't involve building, but it does involve movement in or through public space. And this is of course the advent of the Atlas photographs. I mean, stylistically, it's a jump, but in terms of the fundamental proposition, it's so continuous with what you'd been doing before.
Absolutely. I mean, Le Terme or House Birmingham, why did I do these kind of projects? I wanted to, in a way, squat public place and challenge it and ask questions about our understanding of public place. What is it? So ideally, I want to create a forum where people can have a discussion about the use of the space, and by instigating this kind of building projects, challenging public space as such. So in a way, I see public place defined by the activity that's happening there rather than the architectural parameters. And during House Le Terme, for the first time, I used a different photographic method to record the building and unbuilding of Le Terme. And when I did that, and using a digital method, where I basically recorded one pixel, a row of one pixel, over and over again, and added that together in order to create this kind of time-lapse photograph, so to say, of the space.
It's like building a photograph, yes, actually, you know, like row upon row, like brick upon brick.
Exactly. Yeah. And when I saw the result of it, I was so intrigued and fascinated by it that I thought to myself, well, I have to use this technique in a different project, just a photography project, rather than just using it once every few years when I do one of those building projects. So I immediately had the idea to use this technique I discovered or developed in Le Terme for this new series of recordings of public places, which I called the Atlas, Because ultimately what I do is I photograph over a period of time the activities on central or important public places around the world. And so again, my interest is what happened at this space. Rather than documenting the architectural parameters like you normally do in a photograph, you see the buildings and so on, I wanted to capture the essence of the activity that's happening there. And this is how the Atlas project came about.
So you're going to these different places all over the world, and well, where are they, and what do you do when you get there?
Yes, I mean, as I said, over the years now, I collected quite a lot of different places all around the world, from Australia, Japan, China, Europe, America, everywhere I get to go, either on holiday or because of my work or exhibitions I do. I then record the most significant public place in that city or wherever I am. But as I said, I do it in a very specific way, which then results in these kind of very abstract, beautiful images. Maybe it's important now to explain now how I do these photographs, because as I said before, I photograph a row of pixels and I photograph it over and over again. It's always the same row of pixels. So it's like a slice or cut through the public place. And every 3 seconds or every 5 seconds, I take another slice, another slice. It's always the same slice, but over time I record them. And then I stack them on top of each other in order to create these kind of images that capture the activities on the space itself.
And and also, of course, they capture the architectural, the architecture of the space.
Exactly. So, but what I really do is I don't have a camera that it records only one pixel row. What I do, I take a whole picture, obviously, of the space, and then I select a particular row of pixel. And then via a software I have written with a computer engineer, I extract this row of pixels and put it aside. And then I have the next picture, extract the same row of pixels, and then put it on top of each other. So every time a new image gets taken, I extract the same pixel row and put it on top of each other. So what will happen is, obviously, all the static objects that don't move, for example, like a pillar or like a car, and I cut through it, a parked car, then I stack it on top of each other, it becomes like a column.
And yes, and sometimes that row, sometimes it's evident, but of course if somebody's walking across, at the time you're taking, at the time of the image, then, then it's obscured.
Yes, and then obviously if somebody comes across and disappears, I get a small line, a horizontal line of the person, a cut through the person that appears on the photograph. So when I then look at a photograph, all the horizontal lines that are just there as markings, they are actually people. This is the activities that's happening. Whilst all the vertical lines are usually static objects like architecture. For example, with this one that has been taken in Stockholm, you see bigger blocks of horizontal lines. It's actually the bus, because it's a bus stop. So the bus was there for a little longer period, like a minute or two, and then it disappears again. And then a few minutes later, next bus comes. So you can really start reading these images and the activities that are happening there. And as I said, the vertical lines are the static piece of architecture. And I saw them a little bit like maps. And therefore, I thought it is important to, on the artwork itself, have indicators so people can understand and begin to read them in their way. So it was important for me to have underneath the map, like you have on a map, horizontal markings that describes the space, like in centimeters, and on the vertical corner of on the left side of the image, you have a space line with all the times. So you can really see when each slice was taken. So you have, instead of an ordinary map where you have two, in the Cartesian system, you have two spatial coordinates. On my photographs, you have a time in a space coordinate. So the place all of a sudden is defined by the activity and the time that changes, rather than, as I say, the static, permanent architectural parameters on the place itself.
It's a technique, if you're familiar enough with it, you can read it. I mean, you've mentioned to me that if you look at one of your images, I mean, ostensibly an abstraction, well, actually, it's an abstraction of a place in time, but you can read that, which I find fascinating.
Yes, yes, and once you understand the technique, how it works, you are able to kind of extract, you can start interpreting the image. Now, at the beginning, I was only interested in putting down, there's a legend at the side of the image, as you can see here, like an index of when it was taken, where it was, and when I started the camera, when I ended it, and all the coordinates, and even having a little map that showed where my camera was and what kind of angle I photographed. So to give some help to the people to understand what they're looking at. But then I showed the first photograph to my gallery at that time, and that was the first of the Atlas photographs was taken in Warsaw. And I had my camera set up on a balcony, and I was photographing the old town square. And I was lucky enough that I had access to a power socket, so the camera could run for a long time. So when I switched it on, it was about 9 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday. Nobody was at the place. So the camera was running by itself. So I walked around the place a bit, and then I saw these barriers in one corner of the place where a group of people were standing, like, you know, these kind of street barriers randomly. And I was really intrigued, so I went there and looked what's happening there. And then all of a sudden, 9:30 or so, nobody at the place apart from these few bystanders, a limousine comes and stops just behind this barrier. The door opens and the Dalai Lama got out. And there was the Dalai Lama standing in front of me, waving at me, 3 meters from me. I was completely, I couldn't believe. Then he disappeared into this building. I said, what's going on here? Next limousine comes. Door opens, Lech Walesa steps out. So I couldn't believe myself. On my first photograph, I captured 2 Peace Nobel Prize winners, and they're on my photograph. I couldn't believe. Obviously, what was happening is, they kept it secret, is that, and only few people knew, that the city of Warsaw awarded the Dalai Lama the honorary citizenship because he was on his way through and made a stopover in Warsaw. And it was a small ceremony, so nobody knew about it. But I coincidentally captured that on the photograph. So when I mentioned that story to my gallerists, they said, Wolfgang, this is what sells the image. So you have to put that story onto the photograph, like your data. And this is how I started to think slightly different about the project. So I didn't only want to collect the technical data, I also want to capture the essence of what was happening there by including a sentence describing it. And in that case, obviously, I described that the Lech Walesa and the Dalai Lama showed up for the honorary citizenship to the Dalai Lama. So in a way, the index not only shows the technical data, but also a little story around the photograph. And by that, the Greek have 2 different words for time. One is chronos and one is kairos. Chronos is the quantitative aspect of time, like measuring and like what I did with all the data. But kairos describes the qualitative aspect of time. And by including the sentence in my images, I all of a sudden also included the kairos aspect, not just the chronos aspect. And that kind of, I think, made the artwork what it is now.
You've got this building up from the bottom because you have the two axes. There's another body of work, the trees, where you go from the top down rather than the bottom up. To some extent, I think, because of what is going on in the action, the cutting down of trees, in an urban space, which is a significant fact. Can you talk us through that project? Again, we're not in the countryside. We're in a built environment, but here is the unbuilding, the destruction of a living thing.
Yes, I mean, shortly after, I developed the technique for the atlas, which actually comes originally from finishing photography in sports events, because they exactly photograph one pixel line over and over again and add it together like I do, and then they can exactly tell how fast the people went through. So finishing photographs are exactly done the way I photograph my atlas images. So I didn't invent the technique. The only difference is that they do 1,000 photographs per second, and I do one every 3 seconds. Do you know what I mean? So my time span is far longer than theirs. Now, I thought after a while, what happens if I extract from my camera not just one row of pixel, but extract the top pixel first and then the second pixel row next time with the second photograph, and so on and so forth, which basically would give me a scan over time on the whole image I photograph, rather than just one abstract pixel row. And I had this idea for a long time, but I never found the right project for it. So I knew the methodology and I had the technique to do it, and I tested it, and I got beautiful images out of it, but I never had, from a conceptual point of view, the right project to do it. And then I had the opportunity to work in Vancouver, and I got a residency at the Contemporary Art Gallery there. And this is where I come across people cutting down big trees in urban environments. And I was completely intrigued, and immediately I realized this is what I want to do with this technique. So the technique was in a way first, and then I realized, the significance of removing a mature tree in an urban context, how that completely changes the reading of the place itself, can be captured through this technique best.
It occurs to me that there's a kind of ecology in the way that you work. That is to say, a recycling of materials. There's a kind of, a neatness whereby the circle comes round, you end where you began. There is the business of the cutting down of the tree, maybe for an extremely good reason, but it is the destruction of something, trees, particularly permanent life form, and that one becomes familiar with trees in the way that one becomes familiar with buildings. But I'm wondering if this kind of ecology is perhaps a little more political these days. That your work is becoming perhaps a little less formal and more sort of concerned with current affairs and issues.
Yeah, of course. I mean, in the times we are living, in terms of climate change and in terms of the sustainability discussion, I mean, you can't avoid these themes any longer, and they really have a personal impact on you. And just seeing a mature tree coming down, you really realize you have to kind of record that, and you have to do something with it. And as I said before, the methodology of using this kind of scanning technique, as you can say, time, and combining that with the removal of the tree was so intriguing for me, and I started this kind of series. Also, because I was very familiar with a Japanese artist from the 16th century called Hasegawa Tahoku, who makes these fascinating ink drawings where you see kind of trees just hinted in fog. And basically the fog is an empty piece of paper. It's not there. So you don't, so the mark is just to indicate the trees, whilst the dominance is the missing of a mark. And that makes the image. And I really like that about my tree photographs as well, because the missing of the tree is the essence rather than the tree itself.
You've also got to the analogy of the slicing of the image. I mean, through that one line of pixels with, of course, the slicing through the tree branch or the tree trunk itself, which, of course, is, it's got rings and rings and rings that are also strongly indicating the passage of time.
Absolutely. And what is quite interesting is I started this project again as a pure photography project. But after a while, I realized this could be also quite an interesting film or video installation project. Because, as you understand, I can use basically the time of each of my photographs. When do I start the slicing process in my software? So I have a whole time span where I can start the slicing process. So, and when you add up these images, all of a sudden you get a film where you can see the tree disappearing. So in a way, I found that in that case, the film is even more interesting than the still photographs.
Now, to impress you with the way that I am sort of moving around a circle and coming back to the beginning, I want to move on to the piece that we've just seen at Fabrica Kiosk, because of course a piece that was made of wood, interestingly, I mean wood that would have been made available through the cutting down of trees, and then it has involved the recycling of wood from ecclesiastical buildings, in particular church pews, recycling into a very different kind of ecclesiastical architecture. That is the architecture of the Muslim faith. Again, you're making strong reference to current affairs. I mean, the question of faith is a very hot topic sort of right now. There's no news bulletin that doesn't seem to refer to it one way or another. So could you then just take us sort of, well, not back to the beginning, but could you tell us where you are now, in the light of all of the things that we've discussed, where we are with Kiosk, that's just recently been shown here at Fabrica?
I mean, as an artist, I think most artists do work in order to help them to get an understanding of the world, or to make sense of the world in some way, for themselves very often. And in my case, it's definitely the case. So I try to kind of get an understanding about certain things by doing my projects. And Kiosk is in particular a work like that, because you see so much in the news about all these conflicts between all these different religions, the war on terrorism, all this kind of stuff that's happening in the media all the time. And you wonder, why are people kind of killing themselves when they come from a so-called religious background, where essentially the essence of all the religions is saying the same thing, like be a good human being, don't kill each other and whatever. So that I couldn't somehow get that together. So immediately the question came up about what defines a sacred space. Again, because as you know, I'm very much interested in public spaces and creating a forum for a debate about certain things. In that case, about, sacred space. What defines a sacred space? And then I thought I recycle or use one material that is very strongly loaded with one religion and turn it into an architecture of a different religion. In that case, the pews from the Christian communities, from various Christian communities, and then kind of reclaim the wood or recycle them and build this kiosk or this Persian pavilion with a very strong Islamic language. Particularly my interest was, is a spiritual space defined by the material you use, in that case the pews, or is it the architectural language that you experience, in that case the Islamic language, or is it the context where the building is placed? In our case, Fabrica, a former church, the contemporary art gallery here in Brighton, or is it actually the activity that happens inside? So what actually defines a space? And by kind of muddling this all up and kind of bringing different, in the first side, contradicting things together, I thought I can hopefully provoke a discussion around that.
I mean, it was a church, it's now an art gallery. There's a lot of faith in art, sort of incidentally, but the idea that this is a building that's been reclaimed for another activity, and here we have the material of the Christian church reclaimed to create a structure which, unlike the shelters, is a structure that you can actually enter.
Yes, and you can use it. It is specifically made for, or the people get invited to use it. So what was very nice is that Fabrica had a lot of different events around it. So they had meditation sessions in there, they had different faith communities coming in there, and kind of like they have a whole educational program around it. So I really like that a lot. So it becomes a place where things can happen and things get questioned.
So here we are at the end of a journey. We started with shelters, a structure that was inside an art gallery. We went outside, with the House Birmingham and other projects where you had audiences of passers-by who weren't expecting to see works of art, and now here we are again in dedicated art space. I mean, it's more than 10 years. It's been quite a journey.
Yes, and I feel, as you said before, that there's a big circle in my work, and I come back to similar themes and interests. And I'm very happy that I could do the project with Fabrica here. And in a way, it kind of concludes a lot of my previous works and interests by providing a space for people to interact, to ask questions, to question themselves, to question their beliefs, and question their understanding about what space can do and what space is.